Questions, comments about this? Pastor Rick, what do you hear me saying? What do you think I'm trying to say when I said that?
Pastor Glenn.
Yes.
I just came in again because my signal was not good.
Okay, so you missed some of what I was saying. Okay. Somebody who was here at the
Not
beginning.
all,
Hmm? Janine, can you give me some feedback on what you heard me say?
To take note of the upside down kingdom.
Okay. Sino ta?
Michael, Pastor.
Okay. Sorry, Michael, I still haven't recognized your voice. Okay. So the opening video that I showed was about the upside down kingdom. Good. Other thoughts of what I've shared so far, either from the video, the partial video about Luke, or these two slides that I've shown so far?
Ako, Pastor Glenn.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Eli.
This is Eli.
Mm-hmm.
According to what you've shared, no, I realized na oftentimes we people put Jesus in a box where we limit and we only focus on the shallow knowledge or information about him. And if we focus on kanang basic knowledge and information about him, we will not grow in kuan. We will not grow and we will not learn how amazing and how capable he is in our lives. So that's it, Pastor Glenn.
Very good. Very good. Excellent. Excellent. And for that reason, I know just enough Spanish that once in a while I'm tempted to switch into Spanish. Por eso, for that reason, that is why I'm always asking you why this and why this and why this, so that we can go deeper and deeper. And you're absolutely right, Eli, so that we can discover some of the depth of Jesus, and he will always be greater than we can understand, but we want to go as deep as we can anyway. Good. Okay, I'm going to go back to my slides and do a little bit more review of Matthew, because I felt like I just felt like there was a couple of things that we needed to touch on. Let's see, I've got a few things here that I need to deal with. Okay. Okay, do it that way. And okay. Next week, I expect we're still in the Gospel of Luke, because we're going to be starting him today, but I'm sure we'll still be in Gospel of Luke next week. But as you're reading into the future, into the following week, and as you're reading through the Gospel of John, be looking for, have these questions in mind. What was John's purpose, and how did he accomplish that purpose? And the purpose is stated very clearly in John chapter 20, verse 31. So then what did he do in his gospel that helped him accomplish that purpose. And then in the gospel, according to John, there are 7 times 7 I ams. Actually, there are 14. There are 2 sets of 7 I ams. And see how many of the I ams you can find. Who was the audience? What was their reaction? All of that goes into understanding a little bit about the Gospel of John. So that'll be for, at best, the end of next week, probably more likely the following week. Okay, a little bit of review about Matthew. The fulfillment of hopes, because I went rushing through this last week and really did not do it justice, and so I felt like you might have thought it was not all that important, but I really want you to pick up on these. Matthew presents Jesus as the new Abraham. And here we are. Where Abraham's descendants had cut themselves off from the Gentiles, Jesus, as the human face of God, would redirect God's people back to the nations. And we saw in the opening and the genealogy, the Gentiles were there. Matthew weaves the Gentiles in at different places throughout his account. And then at the end, the Great Commission, Jesus sends his followers to the nations, which you already know. The Greek word for nations is the same that is sometimes translated Gentiles. So Jesus, the human face of God, was the new Abraham. He's the new Moses to teach God's ways, where Moses' followers had twisted God's teachings, twisted them and made them a legalistic requirement. The human face of God would lead God's people to the heart of God's law. You see this especially in the Sermon on the Mount, and other places throughout Matthew's account. Tradition has told you, or the fathers have said to you, or you've heard it said, and then he follows it up with what phrase? But I say to you. In Greek, I had it right on the ego de lego humin. I say to you. Ego de lego humin. Yeah, but I say to you. So you've heard it said, ego de lego humin. But I say to you. And this is the heart. You've heard it said, thou shalt not murder. But I say to you, anyone who hates has committed murder already. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery in your heart. So Jesus, the human face of God, would lead God's people back to the heart of God's law. Jesus, the human face of God, would be the new David, where the Jews of Jesus' day were expecting a military conqueror to come and defeat the Romans and establish a political, geographical kingdom. Jesus, the human face of God, would come and establish not a physical, geographical kingdom, but an eternal spiritual kingdom of obedience to him as king. And then Jesus, the human face of God, would come as the new Israel. Israel, the person Israel, Israel the king, or the kingdom, the nation, the ethnic group, the race of Israelites, where ancient Israel had rebelled against God and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, where the 12 spies went into the land to spy out the land and spent 40 days in there, and 10 of them came back with a negative report that led to their rebellion. Jesus, the new Israel in person, the human face of God, would triumph in the wilderness in 40 days of testing. of fasting and prayer and testing and temptation. So these are important. These are important aspects of Matthew's message, that Jesus, the human face of God, came as a new Abraham, a new Moses, a new David, a new Israel. And then we talked about the about how the gospel came together, and the traditions there. And I just want to keep this illustration in front of us, so we keep it in mind, that none of the gospel writers just sat down and said, well, this is the way I'm going to make the story. They drew on the oral traditions, the things that were the stories that were being shared by eyewitnesses, and then they were collected, and especially Mark, Matthew, and Luke drew from these collections, and we'll talk about John and his process a little bit later. So back to the human face of God notion. He came from God, so he is fully God. He came by virgin birth, but it was a human birth, and so he is fully human. The Gentiles are included. They are part of the mission from the beginning, the first covenant that God made with Abraham, that his descendants would be a blessing to all the people of the world. And then he came in fulfillment of prophecies. And so we followers, Jew or Gentile, are not heretics. We're not blasphemers. We're following the prophecies of God. Comments, questions? So if I were to ask you, if I were to go back and I were to ask you for a review of Matthew, of what you remember about Matthew, what would you say that you remember about Matthew?
Pastor Glenn,
Yes,
Matthew is a new Abraham. Yeah, a new Abraham to bless the Gentiles. And then a new Moses to teach God's ways.
good. Uh-huh,
What I remember, it's a new Israel.
uh-huh,
I forgot the real term, but triumph in, I forgot the next one, but it's a new Israel.
good, good.
Triumph in that.
Mhm. Very good. Okay, so somebody jump in and help Rick on the one new that he couldn't recall.
Based on my to triumph the will in the wilderness.
Right, that's number 4, and you skipped over number 3. So I'm asking somebody else to jump in and help you with number 3.
Pastor,
Janine,
number 3 is new David to establish the kingdom.
good. And what kind of kingdom? Somebody help. Okay, Janine,
Upside down kingdom.
I'm sorry.
Upside down kingdom.
Upside down kingdom. Good. That you're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead into the video we saw of Luke, but that's true. It's an upside down kingdom. Um, but what did I say about Matthew's message? What kind of kingdom is it?
Eternal spiritual kingdom. Pastor.
Eternal spiritual kingdom. Thank you, Kevin. Yes. Good. Okay, good. So that's some good review. Okay. Let's move on then. And we'll talk about Luke. Luke, the gospel according to. Where am I here? Good. Okay, we've said before that all the audiences initially were largely non-readers. Not totally, but these Gospels are written to be read aloud and to be listened to. So, okay, let's jump into the questions that Nancy has for us. Who wrote the Gospel according to Luke? You have studied the New Testament enough, I think, already to know that Luke is part one of a 2-volume work. The second volume is the Acts of the Apostles. Now, that's important in our understanding of who wrote the Gospel according to Luke, because we have clues of the authorship when we look at the Acts of the Apostles. So we're going to turn to the Acts of the Apostles, and you see some references there on number 2 of your screen. You see some references, and I'm going to ask different ones to read just the first verse of each of these. And again, remember, if you've forgotten or you didn't hear me say it before, I want you to read in your own language. So somebody read in your own language, Acts chapter 16, verse 10. Okay. Are we all looking it up in our Bible?
Yes, Pastor.
Okay.
I don't have my Tagalog Bible here. So
Okay, I can wait because other people will have their language in there. So let's see if we can find somebody that'll read. And those who have it in English can just follow along in English. But I'm on a campaign to have us use our local language.
I am using my language in Canada, Pastor.
In Canada?
Province in Canada.
Okay, are you going to read it? Rick, are you going to read it to us in French then?
It's English, no.
No. Yeah, if you're going to read your Canadian Bible, then I want to hear it in French. Okay, who has their Bible in their local language?
Pastor, excuse me, can you repeat that chapter and the
Yes.
verse?
Okay, I've got it on the screen there. It's 16, chapter 6, Acts chapter 16, verse 10.
I'll read it, Pastor.
Okay. Go ahead, Eli.
Mga Act 16 verse 10.
Mhm.
Human gayud sa pananawo ni Pablo, nangandam kami pag-adto sa Macedonia, kay among nasiguro nga ang Dios nagtawag kanamo aron sa pagwali sa maayong balita sa katawhan didto.
Good, thank you. And it says there, we immediately sought to leave, right? And that's the important word in here, is that suddenly the author of Acts has switched from singular pronouns and third person singular, Paul this, they that, he that, all of it is third person, somebody else or other people. And suddenly in verse 10, he switches to first person plural. We immediately sought. Okay, somebody jump over to Acts chapter 20, verse 5. And while you're looking that up, I'll just point out that in chapter 16, the we continues through verse 17. And then it stops. It goes back to they and he. Now in chapter 20, starting, somebody read verse 5.
I will read, Pastor.
Okay, Almi.
Chapter 20, verse 5.
Mhm.
Niuna sila og nagsulat kanamo dito sa Troas.
Okay, I didn't even find it yet. Okay. Okay, so suddenly he switches back into the first person plural, right? We're waiting for us at Troas. So the writer has joined the group again, and it stays in the plural through verse 15, chapter 20, verse 15. Now go to the next chapter, chapter 21, and verse 1. Somebody read that, please.
I will read, Pastor.
Okay, Crystal.
Nagpaalam kami sa ila kag nagtulak. Nagpanakayon kami sing diretso kag nag-abot sa Coos. Sang madason nga adlaw, nagparodas kami kag halin didto nagpadayon kami sa Patara.
Good, thank you. And so there was a brief time there when the author of Acts was not present. And now at the beginning of chapter 21, he joins them again. And that continues through verse 18. Now jump over to chapter 27. And I'm taking a minute because I'm going on my phone also. And chapter 27, verse 1. Somebody read that, please.
Okay, Pastor.
Angie, go ahead.
Sa dihang gikauyonan ang mulawig kami ngadto sa Italia, gitugyan nila si Pablo ug ang pipila ka mga dinanggo ngadto kang Julio, usa ka kapitan sa Romanhong kasundaluhan nga ginganlan kasundaluhan sa emperador.
Good, thank you. So the author of Acts has joined the group again. And this is as they're starting their trip to Rome. And so this continues then on until chapter 28, which is essentially when the arrival in Rome, right? So the author of Acts is with the group, with Paul, through his travels as he's being sent to Rome to meet with to have his case tried before Caesar there. Good. So what does this tell us? Well, at the minimum, this tells us that whoever wrote the book of Acts traveled some of the time with Paul not all the time, but traveled some of the time with him. Okay, Robert Gundry has these points. According to church tradition, Luke wrote the book of Acts, and if he did, the book is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke. Evidence within Acts supports authorship by Luke, and he gives 4 points of support for that. One of which I have eliminated because I thought it was kind of redundant. Just as his gospel opens with the dedication to Theophilus, so also does the book of Acts. So the same person wrote both. We've already established that. Vocabulary and style are very similar in the two books. And though it does not prove that he wrote Luke Acts, frequent use of medical terms agrees with Luke's being a physician. So, and we know that later on, I don't have the reference right in front of me, I think it's Colossians, Paul refers to Luke as the beloved physician. So the fourth point from Dr. Gundry, his use of we in narrating parts of Paul's journeys. The author of Acts implies that he was traveling with Paul. We've already established that. So then who are the options? Who are the possibilities? Well, various men are mentioned as having traveled with Paul. Aristarchus, Tychicus, Timothy, and Mark are mentioned in the third person in the book of Acts. So we have to eliminate those. If any of those 4 had been the author of Acts, they would not have referred to them as in the third person. So that limits the numbers very few. And of the remaining possibilities, really, the use of the medical terminology combined with traveling leaves us almost certainly with Luke being the author of the Acts of the Apostles, and then by extension, the author of the Gospel according to Luke. Okay. So the next question then is when? We might be tempted to think that as soon as Paul arrives in Rome, that Luke wrote these books. Well, that raises a couple questions. One, I grew up thinking that when Paul arrived in Rome, that the next step for him was his execution. But there's significant evidence that Paul was released from that imprisonment, traveled some more, possibly went on to Spain, which was his goal, and then was arrested again and later on was executed. When was he executed? We know that he was executed under the Emperor Nero. Nero died, suicided in AD 67. So maybe it was 68. Nero died in 68. And so the guesses of when Peter and Paul were executed is somewhere in the mid-60s. And so one theory is that Luke wrote the book of Acts sometime after Paul's first arrest, which would have been about the year 62. Others say after his execution, mid-60s in 66, 67. We really cannot narrow it down any more than that. Of course, there are always some, seems like a growing number of scholars who argue for someone other than Luke and writing it even later than all of that. I'm sticking with the late 60s, for both Luke and Acts. Let's see. I got off my notes, and so I need to look where I'm at. There are a couple internal factors about Luke, about the Acts of the Apostles, that tell us that it probably was written before the destruction of Jerusalem. One is that he doesn't say anything about the destruction of Jerusalem. And the argument could be made that that's not the point of the book of Acts, and that's true. The point of the book of Acts is to demonstrate, it follows the chronology, the expansion of the gospel of Jesus from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth. And so when Paul, as one of the representatives of the carrier of the gospel, when he arrives in Rome, then he has arrived at the center of their understanding of the civilized world. We know that other areas were civilized, but they didn't know that at the time. And so symbolically, the gospel has reached the uttermost parts of the earth. So that was the purpose of the book of Acts. And so Luke did not have to mention the destruction of Jerusalem, but the fact that he does not mention it suggests that maybe it had not happened when he wrote his account. The other thing is that he mentions meeting James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother or step-brother of Jesus, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. He goes there with Paul and meets James and the other elders. And James, did I write down when James was martyred? I believe that was in AD 69. Incredible story, yeah, AD 69. James, the stepbrother of Jesus, was such a powerful prayer warrior. He was known, his nickname was Old Camel Knees, because he had been on his knees in prayer for Jerusalem and Judea so much that the calluses had formed on his knees, that they were so hard, like the knees of a camel, that results from kneeling on the hot desert sands. He had prayed so much that the opponents of the Christian faith were focused on him, that during a gap when there was no Roman governor in Jerusalem, during that interval there, that Rome was not immediately in charge, then the Sanhedrin met. They condemned James, the stepbrother of Jesus, condemned him to execution for blasphemy. They led him up to the top of the temple, pushed him off of the temple for his martyrdom, his execution. Some accounts indicate that he did not die from that fall, and so others came and stoned him to death on the steps of the temple in Jerusalem. Anyway, that's kind of a side note, a footnote to the rest of it. That happened in AD 69, and the fact that Luke makes no reference to James, even to suggest in the past tense, would tell us that probably he wrote Acts before that happened. So that means late 60s as the time that Acts was written, and clearly the gospel according to Luke was written before that. Now, as I've said, there are always others who come along and say, oh, it couldn't have been that way. Couldn't be that clear. And I just kind of, I shake my head at people who think that we, living almost 2,000 years later, that we can know better than people who lived within 50 or 100 years of the actual events. Because we have references to Luke as the author of this gospel from people who lived in the 2nd century, in the 100s. So I'm going with the late 60s for when this happened. Comments, questions? I kind of threw a curve at you last week, didn't I, when I said that maybe Matthew did not write the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. I'm still inclined that way, but I'm not gonna sacrifice my life on it. Okay. So who wrote it? Almost certainly Dr. Luke, the beloved physician. When? Probably in the late 60s, somewhere around 67 to 68, in that time frame. Michael, were you getting ready to say something or just? No, okay. All right, moving on. Let's see if I can get this any bigger. So let's have somebody read from Luke now, going back to the leaving the Acts of the Apostles and going back to Luke. And I want somebody to read verses 1 through 4. Again, in your own language.
I'll read, Pastor.
Okay. Okay. Kevin, I heard your voice first.
Pastor. Yes. Luke chapter 1 verses 1 to 4.
Yes.
Halangdong Teofilo, daghan ang nangako sa pagsulat sa asoy may tungod sa mga panghitabo sa atong katilingban. Gisulat nila ang nadungog namo gikan sa unang mga nakasaksi nga nagsangyaw sa mensahe. Busa halangdon nga Teofilo, tungod kay nasusi ko man pag-ayo kining tanan sukad sa sinugdan, nahuna-huna nako nga angay kining isulat sa maayong pagkahanay alang kanimo. Gibuhat ko kini aron masayod ka sa tibuok nga kamatuoran sa mga butang nga gisaysay kanimo.
Good. Thank you. I never know you when you stop until you stop reading. So, okay. You see in the background of this image, the diagram I've shown before about the oral traditions and the different accounts. And then overlaying that are 5 points of how Luke went about writing this. So the first is that he investigated. He did research. By the time Luke began writing his history of Jesus, there were already other accounts, plural, that were being passed around. Some of these, it might have been Q, Mark, Matthew might have been in existence at that time, and other shorter accounts were being passed around of the events involved in the life of Jesus. Second, these accounts were based on oral traditions that were handed down from eyewitnesses. And third, Luke decided to conduct his own thorough, organized search from beginning to end. Apparently, he had a sponsor, a financial sponsor, Theophilus, to whom he dedicated this account and also the Acts of the Apostles. And he wanted Theophilus and others to know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. I've been taught elsewhere, and I didn't come across it in my recent readings, but if you remember, when the last section that we referred to in the Acts of the Apostles, starting at 27 through chapter 28, it is theorized that while Paul was in prison in chapter 27 of Acts of the Apostles, that Luke was traveling through the Holy Land, through Israel, Galilee, interviewing different people there and getting their verbal account of things. For example, Luke is the one who tells us that Mary harbored all these things, kept all these things in her spirit, and dwelt on them and lived on them, and kept those in her. And very likely, very possibly, that came from a personal interview with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and no doubt other interviews with other significant people. As I said a moment ago, he met James, the stepbrother of Jesus. No doubt there were interviews with him and with other elders. And so during this time when Paul was in prison in Caesarea, Luke is traveling in the area and conducting these interviews, gathering his information, bringing it all together so that he can write an orderly account. I skipped over a slide and I need to go back to that, and we'll do that here, because one of the questions that Nancy wants us to address is, what was his relationship? It is worth noting that to all the evidence we have, Luke is the only Gentile who wrote anything in the Bible. So he's a Gentile Christian. He was a companion of Paul. He was accepted by James, the stepbrother of Jesus, and, quote, the elders. And so he's accepted into the leadership of the first generation followers of Jesus. So we can conclude that, yes, he had a good relationship with the Lord. And you've already learned from your other biblical literature courses that that's one of the requirements for being accepted into the canon in the New Testament, is that the person be either an apostle of Jesus or first generation follower of an apostle. And in this case, Luke was a companion of Paul. Now, jumping on down where I should have gone next, the purpose of Jesus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So this is being written for Theophilus, who was a new believer apparently, and for other new believers, Gentiles, possibly Jews as well, but primarily Gentiles. That is and a strong degree of Greek culture, whereas Mark is assumed to be written to more of a Roman culture. Luke is written to a predominantly Greek culture, or Greek culture. Okay, I have next the same video that I showed part of a little bit earlier, and I believe we have more people here than we did then. And by putting it on here, then it will be included in the recording, whereas I think we missed it. We did not have it in the recording at the beginning. So I'll play this in its entirety. It will be repeated, but every teacher knows and every student knows that we have to hear things more than once before it starts sinking in. So let's go to this now. And where am I here? Okay, we're going to send you down. We're going to lift you up.
The Gospel of Luke. Luke investigated many of the earliest eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus and then composed this account.
And the story begins up in the hills of Jerusalem, the place where Israel's ancient prophets said that God himself would come one day to establish his kingdom over all the earth.
In the city is the temple, run by the priests, and one of them, named Zechariah, was working in the temple when he had a vision that freaks him out. An angel appears and says that he and his wife will have a son. What's this all about?
Well, Zechariah and his wife, we're told, are very old. They've never been able to have children. And Luke's setting up a parallel here with Abraham and Sarah, the great ancestors of Israel, because they too were very old and could never have kids.
Yet God gave them a son, Isaac, which is how the whole story of Israel began.
And so Luke's implying here that God's about to do something that significant for this people once again.
The angel tells Zechariah to name the son John.
And then he says that this son's going to fulfill a promise of Israel's ancient prophets, that somebody would come one day to prepare Israel to meet their God when he arrived to rule in Jerusalem.
Because right now, Jerusalem is ruled by the Romans.
Yeah, specifically, it's governed by a man named Herod, who's a puppet king under the Roman Empire. And so the Jewish people wanted nothing more than to be free and govern themselves in their own land.
So this is shocking news. Everything's going to change. God's on his way. But how is he going to arrive?
Well, to find out, Luke takes us out of Jerusalem and then up into a small town in the hills of an out-of-the-way region called Galilee. And there we find a young woman named Mariam, or we call her Mary. She was engaged to be married.
And then an angel appears to Mary, saying that she's going to have a son.
She's supposed to name him Jesus, which in Hebrew means the Lord saves. And he will be a king like David, who will rule over God's people forever.
And then Mary asks, okay, well, how is this possible? Because I'm a virgin.
And she's told that the same Holy Spirit that brought life and light out of darkness in Genesis chapter 1 is going to generate life inside her womb. God is about to bind himself to humanity through the conception and the birth of the Messiah.
And so Mary goes from some backwoods no-name girl to the future mother of the king?
Exactly. In fact, she sings a song about how this reversal of her own social status points to a greater upheaval to come. Through her son, God's going to bring down rulers from their thrones and exalt the poor and the humble. He's going to turn the whole world order upside down.
So when Mary was really pregnant, she and her fiancé Joseph had to go down to Bethlehem.
Yeah, there was a decree across the Roman Empire about new taxes, and so everybody had to go get registered in the town of their family line.
There were so many visitors in Bethlehem, they can't find a guest room.
And so the only place they can find is a spot where animals sleep.
Now nearby were some shepherds with their flocks, and an angel appears, which of course freaks them out. But they're told to celebrate, because tonight in Bethlehem, a savior has been born.
Yeah, they're told to go and find this baby, and they'll know that it's the Messiah because he's going to be wrapped up and laying in a grimy feeding trough.
Yeah, which is pretty gross.
Totally. And then these shepherds, who aren't very clean themselves, they go and find the newborn Jesus in this really dingy place, and their minds are blown. They go home wondering what on earth is about to happen.
And this is all really strange. I mean, if God's really coming to save the world, this isn't how you would expect him to arrive. Born in an animal shelter to a teenage girl, celebrated by no-name shepherds.
Exactly. I mean, everything is backwards in Luke's story, and that's the point. He is showing how God's kingdom was first revealed in these dirty places among the poor, because Jesus is here to bring salvation by turning our world order upside down.
Okay. What do you think? I want to do a little bit of commentary on this, and I haven't gone into very much details on any of the Gospels we've done, and that's on purpose because a lot of the commentaries, a lot of the details you can get. Read any commentary, you're going to get various views of the details. but I want to talk about the Christmas story, partly because we are in the Burr months already, right? Have been in the Burr months for 1.5 months already, and we've got a little ways to go. And in a little while, in not too many weeks, right after we finish this semester, we will be reenacting the Christmas story in our various churches. So I want to talk about it a little bit. Last week, I messed with your mind a little bit and said when I suggested that maybe Matthew did not write the gospel according to Matthew, and I'm not going to force your opinion. I'm not going to force you to take my opinion on that. But I want to share some things about the Christmas story that might sound like I'm ruining the story, but it's really helpful to us to get it in a realistic perspective. And for source on this, I've got the name of my source there, Lee Strobel, The Case for Christmas. Lee Strobel was, when he was a young man, was an atheist. If I recall, I forget if he was an attorney or a research reporter or both, but he did extensive research and then came out with his first book was The Case for Christ. And then he's done a series, The Case for This and The Case for That, different things where he gives real down-to-earth evidence supporting what really happened. He's a strong believer, strong defender of the faith. And so I encourage you to look up Lee Strobel in whatever resources you can and benefit from his insights. So what I'm going to be sharing with you now is largely based on what he shared with us in a series that Nancy and I watched, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, called The Case for Christmas. So first of all, Bethlehem was a tiny village, tiny town of maximum of 2,000 population. So there was no hotel for them to check into for the night. There was no inn where they would be turned away because there was no inn for travelers to come to. So there was nothing like that. So we're stuck with this translation of there was no room for them in the inn. Instead, when people were traveling through, they stayed in private homes. And since Joseph's ancestry was from Bethlehem, he almost certainly had relatives living there, already living there. And he would have arranged for him and his bride to stay with those relatives. And even if he did not have relatives, it would have been culturally taboo to leave, to turn away a pregnant woman at any level of her pregnancy. It would have been culturally taboo to turn away any traveler. You would have found a safe place in-house for them to stay, not out in a cave, not out in the barn, but in-house. There would have been some kind of arrangement. Think back to the stories in the Old Testament when a traveler is going through a city, and think of the angels who went into Sodom and Gomorrah, and part of the crime of Sodom was that they would not accept these travelers into their home, and so Lot took them into his home. Why? Because culturally that's what you do. Later on in the book of Judges, you've got the Levite who's traveling, and the city, I think it was Gibeah, would not accept them into their homes. And so one old man says, oh, you can't stay out in the street, you've got to come in. Culturally, in that part of the world, culturally, and really here in the Philippines, we bring people in if we see them in need. And there's always room for another person, especially if they see a pregnant young woman, they would have brought her in. The next thing is that most of our nativity scenes, and even this video that we just watched, they picture Joseph and Mary arriving just as she's going into labor, and oh my goodness, the labor pains have already started. Now I have to find a place to have my baby. No, this was not what's going on. The census took place occurred over a period of months. And so Joseph and Mary would have traveled there before she went into labor. They would have already been located and situated in Bethlehem. The problem was the house where they were staying. And so, okay, so they were already in Bethlehem when she went into labor. They had already arrived sometime before. And that brings us to a very important word. The word kataluma, which in Luke chapter 2, verse 7 is translated the inn. There was no room for them in the inn. But the same word in Mark 4:14 is translated guest chamber. The same word in Luke 22:11 is translated guest chamber. And in the Septuagint, you see this LXX. If you have not had your Old Testament literature, Old Testament survey yet, then I'll let you know. LXX stands for Septuagint. This is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The same word is translated kataluma, or the Hebrew word is translated with this same kataluma and translated into English as parlor. So this word here in Luke 2:7 is not saying there was no room for them in the hotel. It's saying there was no room for them in the guest room, in the guest chamber. And so let's go back to this picture. Upstairs is where the family lived. There would be a main room where the family themselves stayed. There would be a guest chamber over here where that was available when guests came. The problem was that other people had crowded into Bethlehem. There were other descendants of David, other Bethlehemites, maybe not descendants of David, but other descendants of Bethlehem who had come to their home village. And so other people had arrived there before Joseph and Mary did. And so the guest chamber was already full, but still Mary and Joseph would have been squeezed into some space in this upper room. So what was this down here? This is where the animals stayed during the night. And they had a ramp. This is what Lee Strobel demonstrates in his video series. There was a ramp that led from down here to upstairs, and the food for the animals, there's some of it would have been down here, but some of it would be upstairs because the animals had the freedom to be either down here or to go to follow the ramp up and be up here. And wherever the animals were, there would be food for them. Now, it really bugs me in this video when they assume that because the people were poor, therefore the surroundings were dirty, and they laid this baby in the dirty manger. No, just because they're poor, just because they're simple, does not mean the place was dirty. I suspect that some of the people listening to me and watching this right now are not what we call rich people, and yet your homes are clean. You keep them clean, sometimes cleaner than the wealthy people do. So let's not say that this place was dirty. There was hay around. If it came time and the baby was born and they needed a place to lay the baby down, there was clean hay available that they could put into the manger so that there was a place for the baby to lie down, to be laid down. So when we read there was no room in the guest chamber, it means that someone else was already there. And okay, I'm jumping, I got off my notes, but I was following them anyway. Okay, said all that already. So here are Joseph and Mary with their newborn baby. Where will they lay him? After Mary gives birth, she's tired. All of you mothers listening and watching, you know that after you give birth, you are exhausted. And yes, you want to cuddle that baby for a little while, and then you simply want to sleep. So where do you put the baby? You get some clean hay, you put the clean hay on the manger. You're not going to lay him on the floor. You get some clean hay, you put it in the manger, the feeding trough, and you put the baby wrapped up in swaddling clothes, wrap him up to keep him safe, and lay him on the clean hay. The manger is right there. It's not a filthy place. It has fresh hay. Joseph and Mary are not wealthy, proud people. Mary is tired. The baby has fallen asleep after feeding. They need to lay him down. Where else are they going to put him? They're not going to put him on the floor. The fresh hay would be a soft, clean, safe place for him. Well, all of that is not really on topic, but when we're supposed to be studying the message of the Gospel of Luke, but since I already suggested last week that maybe the Gospel according to Matthew was written by a redactor instead of Matthew himself, then I figured I might as well go ahead and mess with your assumptions about Christmas while I'm here. Oh yes, and one more thing. Jesus was not born on December 25. Maybe you already knew that. He was not born any time during the winter. My grandfather was a sheep herder. The sheep the sheep herders would not have been out in the middle of winter watching their flocks by night. They would have been out watching the flocks during birthing season, and that would have been during the spring. So probably sometime in the spring is when they would have been out watching their flocks by night. And so we might put the birth of Jesus then. Why we celebrate Christmas on December 25th is a whole other topic for another class and another time of research. So, okay then, with all of that, let's move on to the overall message of Luke, the overall message that Luke has in mind in his account. Before we move on, I really want to pause and give you opportunity to ask questions, clarification. I've gone through a lot of information here. We've watched the video, part of it we've watched twice, all of it we watched once. I really want you to ask some questions. Okay, don't come to me later on and say, Pastor, what did that mean? Okay, this is the time to ask that, because if you're wondering that question, almost certainly somebody else is wondering that question also. The Gospel of Luke is associated with the ox. I mentioned to you last week when we talked about Matthew that the symbol is the character above the person who is writing. And so you have Luke down below writing on his scroll, and up above you have some kind of a strange looking bull, ox, cattle, something, holding a book between his four paws, four legs, with the wings there, and that would be the symbolic representation of Jesus as Luke describes him. So there you can see it a little more clearly. Of course, these depictions, these paintings were made in a time when art had not really gone in the direction of realism, and so it's all symbolic, representative. They did not feel the need to make the ox look like an ox or the bull look like a bull. They are representing messages. And this is the one from the book of Duro. I'm not sure what mental image comes to your mind when you hear the word ox. This is, as I said, from the book of Duro. Does not look like an ox to me. Looks almost like a Holstein steer, but that would be consistent with the book being created in Ireland, which the Holsteins are from the British Isles. Now, I will admit that I'm a city kid. I don't know cattle, but when I was in high school, my dad moved to a farming community where he was pastor, and I worked for a period of time on a dairy farm. So when I think of cattle, of any kind of cattle, this is the kind of cow, steer, calf, heifer that I think of. This is actually a Guernsey, which is from the British Isles also. So when I read in the Old Testament that the men had to sacrifice a calf or a bull in their sacrifices, this is the kind of animal I think of. A steer like this. Just about the only thing these cattle are good for, two things. They can make babies that will become a cow that will give milk, or you can slaughter them for beef, for hamburgers, steaks, and such like. They are not cut out for work. But when we talk about the ox in the Bible, we're probably talking more like this kind of an animal. What do you call this animal?
Carabao.
Carabao?
Carabao.
Okay. I've seen it spelled with an L or an R. Carabao. It's a work animal, right? And there would be, I don't know very much about them. I know that they are work animals. This is probably more like what the Bible pictures when it talks in the Old Testament about sacrificing a bull. It's talking about sacrificing a work animal. So let me ask you, what are some of the characteristics of the Carabao in the Philippines? Characteristics of the Carabao.
Yes, Doc. Yes, sir.
Characteristics of the Carabao.
Characteristic of Carabao.
What's he good for?
Strength.
Strength, good.
Hard worker.
Hard worker, strong
Hard
and
worker, good. Anything else?
Obedient to his
Obedient.
master.
Oh, good. Good.
Helper.
A helper, good.
Humble.
Ooh, good. Humble. Mhm.
persistent.
Ooh, I like it. Persistent. Oh, you're teaching me a lot.
Faithful.
Faithful? Uh-huh.
Faithful to his master.
Right. Since I don't know anything about Carabao, are they, when you say faithful to the master, are they, how do I say this? If they belong, Emmanuel, since you were giving some of those answers, do you have a Carabao? Do you own a Carabao already?
No, but I have tried to command a Carabao.
Okay. And did he obey you?
Yes.
Okay.
So
that kind of answers my other question, because we talk about pets, like a dog can be a one-person dog. He only responds to this master. But that's not true of the Carabao, right? Whoever's handling the reins or the yoke or whatever can command him. Is that right?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm learning. Good. Well, let's thank you for that. And I think some of the things that you said will come out again as we go forward here and talk about in the biblical usage of this animal. So keep this picture in mind, this animal, as we go forward. Maybe you already did, but for me as a city kid, North American, I need this education. Okay. So okay. The cultural background, you've kind of already talked about this, not much different. He was a hard worker. Okay, let me back up. We're going to go back here. In the Gospel according to Mark, Jesus suddenly appeared, preaching. In Mark, Jesus was like a lion. Just suddenly he's there in action. Mark wanted his readers to think about the evidence and decide for themselves. The Gospel according to Matthew, Jesus' genealogy introduced us to Jesus as the son of Abraham, the son of David, a Jewish boy who started a Gentile religion. He was the human face of God. Now, in the Gospel according to Luke, we begin with an old priest who is not able to make a baby. In those days, it was assumed to be the wife's fault, but we cannot say for sure. In Mark, Jesus was a lion, suddenly leaping into action. In Matthew, Jesus was the human face of God, the teacher of Israel, who surpassed Abraham, Moses, and David. Now in Luke, Jesus is an ox, slowly, deliberately following the steps that would lead him to his purpose. The ox was the ancient world's most powerful engine. One of the speakers a moment ago talked about the strength. Most powerful engine, to the point that he was the symbol of divine strength in countries from Assyria to Egypt. The Lord is often described as, quote, the mighty one. The Hebrew word abir is a play on words. The Hebrew word for the mighty one, God, is a play on words, because for the word for the mighty ox is very similar, abir, with a double B instead of a single B. You have to know Hebrew to catch the difference there, and I don't know Hebrew. The final blessing that Moses gave to the tribes of Israel, he refers to Joseph, a firstborn bull, the horns of a wild ox. The ox was used for work. He was the universal beast of burden, carrying heavy loads, plowing, treading grain, and more. Anytime that strength was needed in work, the ox was called on. To the point that Solomon in Proverbs 14:4 says, where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but much revenue comes from the strength of the ox. So the ox is a symbol of wealth, important enough to include a warning to ancient Hebrews not to cover their neighbor's ox. That's Exodus 20, verse 17. He was considered the king of domestic animals. And then in the religious context, the ox would bear the burden of sin as a sacrificial animal. Leviticus 4, verses 3 to 21, Psalm 69, verse 31. Somebody in whatever, even in English if you want to, read for us Psalm chapter 16, Psalm 69, verses 30 and 31, in whatever language.
I will read Pastor.
Okay.
Psalms chapter 69, verse 30 to 31.
Mhm.
I will praise God's name in song and glorify him with thanksgiving. This will please the Lord more than an ox, more than a bull with its horns and hooves.
Good, thank you. So this is a sacrifice that is given for Thanksgiving, for sin offering. Okay, keep your Bibles available. Okay, the next reference is 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 24 and 25. This is after David ordered the census and the plague came. And what did David do? Somebody read 2 Samuel 24, verses 24 and 25.
2 Samuel 24:25. It says, but the king replied to Araunah, no, I insist on praying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land the plague on Israel was stopped.
Good. Thank you.
That-
So he sacrificed the oxen. He broke down the wagon and built an altar and sacrificed the oxen as intercession for the nation of Israel facing their plague. I'm not recommending that we do that for our plague currently. Okay, Second Chronicles chapter 7, verses 4 and 5. Somebody read that for us.
Okay, already ba, sir? Second
Okay.
Chronicles chapter
James?
7,
Uh-huh.
verse 5.
4 and 5.
Second Chronicles chapter 7, 4 and 5,
Yes.
verse 4. Then the king and all the people offered sacrifice before the Lord. Verse 5. And King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 head of cattle and 120,000 sheep and goats. So the king of all the people dedicated the temple of God.
Good. This is after the temple has been completed. This is the dedication ceremony for the temple. And what did Solomon sacrifice? 22,000 of what? Cattle, oxen. Good. Okay. And also Second Chronicles 29, verses 20 to 22. Somebody read that, please. Second Chronicles chapter 29, verses 20 to 22.
I will read the story.
Okay.
Early the next morning, King Hezekiah gathered the city officials together and went up to the temple of the Lord. They brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 male lambs, and 7 male goats as a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. The king commanded the priests, the descendants of Aaron, to offer this on the altar of the Lord. So they slaughtered the bulls, and the priest took the blood and splashed it against the altar. Next, they slaughtered the rams and splashed their blood against the altar. Then they slaughtered the lambs and splashed their blood against the altar.
Good. Thank you. How many bulls?
7, Pastor.
7? Where did I get the number 600? Okay, whatever it is. So he sacrificed the bulls. Again, this is the rededication of the temple after the nation and even the religious leaders had wandered away and corrupted and polluted the religious practices. Then during the revival that Hezekiah instigated, when they cleaned out the temple, they rededicated the temple. Among the sacrifices was the oxen sacrificed for the people. Bear in mind, in all these ancient ideas of power and strength, work and wealth, sacrifice and the temple, for Luke's portrait of Jesus is supremely, for Luke's portrait of Jesus, he is supremely the bearer of burdens, caring for all those who are burdened or suffering, and ultimately giving himself willingly as a sacrifice. Okay, I'm going to read this that's on the screen again, and I want you to read it aloud where you are. You can leave your mic off, that's fine, but I want you to read it aloud where you're at in the, this is talking about Jesus as he is described in the book of Luke, okay? I'm gonna read it aloud, you read it where you're at. 1, 2, go. Jesus is supremely the bearer of burdens, caring for all those who are burdened or suffering, and ultimately giving himself willingly as a sacrifice. To put it in a shorter way, Jesus is the burden-bearing sacrifice of God. Jesus is the burden-bearing sacrifice of God. Okay, I have a confession to make to you. I am sick. I have been sick since last night. I am sick still now. So I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms early. And if I get in trouble with Ted, then I'll deal with that at that point. Before I send you to your breakout rooms, okay, that's not what I wanted, but we'll deal with it. Before I send you to your breakout rooms, I want to make 1 or 2 comments about it. When you go to your breakout rooms, this is not the time for you to leave the class. This is not when you go to your phone and let the others in your breakout team cope with your absence. This is part of your participation in the class. This is a team project. We are saved as a group. We enter the kingdom of God as becoming part of a group. We march to Zion as part of a group, as part of the army of God. And so I'm asking you to learn to work as a team, to be part of the team. And when you go to the breakout room, to go to the breakout room. Maliwanag?
Yes, Pastor.
Yes, Pastor.
Okay. Let's not dump all of this on 1 or 2 people in your team. There's only 4, at the most 5 in a team. Let's be a team, work together, cooperate. No one is the boss. Work as a team and honor the Lord. You will be graded as a team. Don't bring the others down. And don't lean on them to bring you up. Let's be a team about it. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms, and I'll ask you to be on there for the remainder of the time. I might be on camera, I might not. Like I said, I am sick, have been since last night, actually since yesterday morning. So I might be here in front of the camera, I might not. I'll have the camera on, I'll be coming and going. So, okay, I am opening the breakout rooms, asking you to join your respective teams now.
Pastor Glenn,
Yes.
there's only room 1.
Oh, sorry. Ooh. Sorry. Oh, wow. Okay. So, okay, I have to go back now. I'm embarrassed. Not the first time and won't be the last time.
It's okay, Pastor.
At least you know I'm human, right? Okay, breakout rooms. Yeah, it has to wait till it goes through the timeout thing. Okay. Still. Add room. There. Now there are 4.
Get well soon, Pastor.
Hmm?
Get well soon.
Thank you.